This episode of Geek's Guide to the Galaxy is made possible thanks to support from listeners like you. So if you enjoyed the show and want it to continue, please sign up to give us $1 or $2 per episode over at patreon.com/geeks. And if you'd rather make a one-time contribution, you can do that via check or PayPal over at geeksguideshow.com/crowdfunding. And so I want to give a special thank you to Galina Fredkina, who just made a very generous contribution to the show via PayPal. Galina writes, "Thank you for your podcast, especially for the Dune, Picard, and Time Loop episodes." So big thanks again to Galina Fredkina, and to everyone else who's contributed. We really appreciate it. Alright, so now let's get to our show.
Wired.com presents The Geek's Guide to the Galaxy. And here is your host, David Barr Kirtley.
Hello, and welcome to episode 451 of Geek's Guide to the Galaxy. Today on the show, we'll be discussing Season 1 of Star Trek Lower Decks, a new animated series from former Rick and Morty showrunner Mike McMahon. And this will include spoilers for every episode of the show, so just be aware of that. And I'm joined by 3 guests. So first up, we've got Sara Lynn Michener, making her 21st appearance on the show. She's a trans-supporting Ravenclaw Trekkie maker feminist who writes at Medium and lives in Connecticut with a Renaissance engineer and a small zoo. She considers Star Trek to be her third and best parent. So Sarah, welcome to the show.
Happy to be here.
Then next up, we've got Rawfield Jordan, making his 14th appearance on the show. He's written over 25 feature films, including Lost Colony, The Legend of Roanoke, The Immortal Voyage of Captain Drake, and Star Runners. He also co-created and co-wrote Salvage Marines, an upcoming space opera series starring Armand Assante and Casper Van Dien, as well as an upcoming supernatural drama series for the CW. He's also the lead guitarist of Viscera, an LA-based rock band who just released a sci-fi concept album, Siren Star. So, Rafael, welcome to the show.
Always a pleasure.
And also joining us today is Christopher M. Cevasco, making his 12th appearance on the show. He's the former editor of Paradox Magazine, and his short fiction appears in magazines such as Nightmare and Beneath Ceaseless Skies. He's also written 19 Dungeons & Dragons supplements, including the best-selling Felosiel's Ultimate Guide to Poison, which are available now through the DM's Guild website. He's currently seeking representation for the first book in an alternate history trilogy with a dash of magic, as well as 3 other historical novels. So, Chris, welcome to the show.
Glad to be back.
All right, so let's start off with Rafael. So, Rafael, it's been a while since I talked to you about Star Trek. So even before we get to Lower Decks, I was just curious, what have you thought of Star Trek, kind of the direction of the Star Trek franchise with Discovery and Picard and everything?
That's a tough question. I have a lot of friends who are purists when it comes to this stuff and aren't really into basically anything since 2005. Admittedly, I enjoy all of it for various reasons. I think they all kind of have their unique pleasures. I've really enjoyed Picard, Discovery, Lower Decks, the Kelvinverse movies. I'm here for all of it, man.
And so then I talked to Chris and Sarah 2 episodes ago a little bit about Lower Decks, and I hadn't seen it, so they kind of encouraged me to watch it. So Rafael, did you watch Lower Decks when it first came out, or like what made you watch it?
I was a little hesitant at first. I wasn't sure if I was really going to like it, but I was definitely won over by the 3rd or the 4th episode, and I know it might be sacrilegious to say it might be my favorite Star Trek thing right now. I think I would take this show over any other future show. I need more of Lower Decks.
Wow, that's So let's talk about that. But I think it's interesting that you said that you weren't sure you were going to like it, and Chris and Sarah said the same thing. Mm-hmm. And certainly I don't think I'd even really heard of this. I think I just logged into CBS All Access to watch Discovery. And then it's like, oh, there's also the Star Trek cartoon. And, for whatever reason, it didn't really appeal to me, even though I like animation and I like Star Trek and I like science fiction cartoons and everything. So I guess that's the first thing I want to talk about. Why does anyone have any ideas about why this show kind of doesn't make a good first impression, even before you've even watched any of it? Why do we all have that?
A lot of it probably has to do with just, we have so many preconceptions about animated shows, and you kind of in a lot of extremes. You know, you have sort of the Family Guy stuff, Beavis and Butthead's, you know, adults cartoon stuff, and then you have on the other end of it, Star Trek, the animated series, which is honestly the only Star Trek that I have not watched in full, because I find it, you know, relatively juvenile and a little boring. I think I liked it when I was a kid. But, you know, it's just sort of, you have these two polar extremes, and you know that the likelihood that the new animated thing, whatever it is going to fall into one of those. And there isn't really an in-between there. You know, it would be kind of nice actually if there were. You know, it's either sort of on the definitely for adults spectrum or the definitely for kids spectrum. So it'd be nice if there were sort of a Pixar of, you know, animated comedy series that was both for adults and children, but we don't really have that yet. And so I think because people have strong preconceptions about their existing experiences with those cartoons, it's difficult for people to detach from that and have a fresh perspective.
Yeah. And the Star Trek animated series you mentioned, in case people don't know, is from the 70s. Ran for 2 seasons. I've never actually watched it. I don't know if Chris or Rafael ever.
I have not watched it either. And it's the only Trek that I haven't watched at all.
So do you have like an anti-cartoon?
No.
Bias?
I definitely don't. You know, part of it probably is a little bit of what Sarah was saying. I think for me, it's more just a weird kind of hang up that I have in general when there's something that I enjoy and I'm into and passionate about, like Star Trek. You know, I don't like when shows in general kind of try to, you know, mix it up and change format or go with like, oh, let's have a comedic episode. Let's have a musical episode. Those sorts of things just always fall flat for me. Even when they're really well done, you know, and, you know, it just sort of throws me out of the sort of, you know, the verisimilitude of the world. And I just don't like it. It just breaks continuity for me somehow. And not just when it comes to cartoon versus live action. I mean, I think that's with anything. Like, I'm not into things like Board of the Rings, you know, by the Harvard Lampoon, or, you know, it doesn't matter the format. I'm just sort of a purist, you know. Now, that being said, you know, I think when I went into it, my hesitation was, this is just going to be something lampooning Star Trek and poking fun at something that, you know, is near and dear to my heart. But I think by the, you know, as Rafael was saying, and I think as we were mentioning last time, by like the second, third, fourth episode, it became more and more apparent that the writers here love it just as much as we all do and are deeply knowledgeable about the material and are writing it from a place of love and respect, while gently poking fun at all the kind of stuff that we as Trekkies also like to talk about and, you know, point out the foibles and the flaws of the earlier shows.
Yeah, I'm actually a big fan of animation in general, and Mike McMahon specifically. I really enjoyed Solar Opposites and his work on Rick and Morty, and I've seen the animated series, but I think what made me particularly skeptical here going into it was simply that this was going to be an awkward fit into the Star Trek canon. Like, how do you toe that line tonally where it's silly and funny, but also still heartfelt and serious and poignant? And I was actually very impressed and happy to be surprised. And, you know, to Mike McMahon admitted himself, they kind of figured it out by the last 3 or 4 episodes. They were still kind of figuring out what the show was for about half the season. And, you know, I think to the previous point, yeah, it takes diehard fans to really make fun of something well and lovingly like this, you know?
Yeah, I mean, I think, you know, when the box popped up on CBS All Access, I think I sort of just subconsciously even assumed like, oh, they are like making Star Trek Discovery and this is like, you know, sort of like a little bonus thing, you know, to sort of, you know, milk the franchise as much as they can. And, you know, because we were talking last time about how they're trying to put as many Star Trek shows into production as possible so that there's always some new Star Trek thing coming out. So I wouldn't have necessarily thought that this was something that they were, you know, bringing their A game to. Mm-hmm. I didn't know that Mike McMahon was involved. I'm actually a really big fan of Rick and Morty, and I think like part of the reason I like Rick and Morty so much is because a lot of the stories in it are really smart science fiction stories, even just leaving aside the humor. So, for example, the episode where there are these aliens, sort of these shape-shifting aliens, and they implant memories of themselves into your mind to make you think that you've known them your whole life. I think it's just a great idea, even if it weren't funny. It's just a great concept. So Chris and Sarah recommended this show, and then I went and looked and saw, the creator of it is the guy who was sort of, I think, the sort of big sci-fi guy on Rick and Morty, the one who was most deeply familiar with the genre.
Yeah.
So that actually, if I had known that, I would have checked the show out a lot sooner.
And I think there's also something of a paradoxical nature to the show that had me dubious. I mean, I like the idea of stories here or there about characters in the lower decks, but how do you make a whole series out of that? And in a way, they're not doing that. I mean, by their own admission, as the series goes on, it involves the bridge crew more and more because that became necessary to tell better stories.
Yeah, I was really skeptical that they would actually be able to do that. I guess just by way of background, and you guys all know Star Trek much better than I do, but there's an episode of the original of Next Generation called The Lower Decks, where you see some of the sort of more minor or people in minor roles on the ship that you wouldn't normally see.
Mm-hmm.
And so this is kind of, riffing off of that.
Which was a great episode too.
Mm-hmm.
And they also did a similar thing in Voyager.
Yeah.
I don't remember what the episode was called, but it was the one where Janeway takes the sort of lower deck crew on a mission.
Yeah. Yeah, I love the privileged glimpse into these lower decks and the characters that live there. But invariably, as the show goes on, they get promoted. We've already seen how Boimler gets promoted. Beckett resists it, but eventually she will be, presumably. I mean, that's just going to be the character arc. So, they won't be lower decks for long.
Well, that's what, because I've heard, that if you ever watched the first episode of The West Wing, it's all about the people who work for the president, and then you don't ever really see the president. He just comes in at the very end of the episode and makes a big speech. And the original plan for The West Wing was for every episode to be like that. But then there's just sort of like, if the president is the one making the decisions, it's hard not to have him become more and more of a character. And I feel like there's probably a similar dynamic with a Star Trek show where you're trying to not make it about the bridge crew, but if they're the ones doing all the coolest stuff and making all the big decisions, how long do you avoid sort of that gravitational pull?
Yeah.
But I don't know, Sarah, what do you think? What do you think about this? Just this basic idea of focusing on the lower decks kind of characters?
I think it's great, especially, I mean, the Lower Decks episode of TNG is such a tearjerker. It's one of the best, very dramatic episodes that they've done. It's the kind of episode where you might, use that episode to introduce somebody who's not familiar with Star Trek, who's never watched any Star Trek, to let them know what it's about. Just kind of showcase what Star Trek can do. So it was kind of amusing that they took this incredibly, serious episode, and decided to sort of center the idea of this spoof around it. But yeah, I mean, I think it kind of works because so much of the show on a meta level is not just making fun of Star Trek, and as you said, from a loving perspective, not we're sort of laughing with Star Trek. We're not laughing at it, but not only that, but also it's sort of making fun of Trekkies, like the way that, the Trekkies documentary, was to watch as a Trekkie. So, and a lot of this, is born of meme culture. There's a group on Facebook called Star Trek Shitposting. It's probably the group that I spend the most time in, as a Trekkie online. A lot of the normie Star Trek groups can get a little bit irritating. And so weirdly enough, there's better content in the Star Trek shitposting group. And a lot of the jokes come directly from Star Trek shitposting. And the members of the group were very proud of that. And we were always spent like about 2 weeks trying to figure out, okay, who are the members, the secret spies who actually work for this writing staff, because we know that they are in this group. So, it's really funny. I mean, a lot of it is, a lot of the jokes, the in-jokes are Star Trek memes and things that people have made fun of the series for years. but it always is absolutely from, perspective of loving Star Trek, which is sort of what makes it wholesome.
Yeah, I think there's sort of a natural inclination going into, especially a cartoon like this, to be like, oh, are these guys real Star Trek fans? And they definitely are. I mean, they're much. I'd have to say they're much bigger Star Trek fans than I am. I mean, there were so many things in the show where I'm like, okay, I know this is a reference to something, but I mean, I can just tell that this is a reference to something, but I sure don't know the reference.
Well, that's another thing that I love about it is it's, I mean, on the one hand, it's enjoyable for the comedic aspects, but it's also a real deep dive into Star Trek lore. That's just, it's not just the lower deck characters. There's like sort of the lower deck, bits of history and lore from Star Trek that they're bringing back to life. I mean, the big villains in the final episode were, those, what are they called?
The Pack Lads.
Pack Lads. Yeah. I mean, that they came out of left field, but that was so cool to kind of see, oh yeah, what's been going on with them? Wow. Okay. Totally. I mean, and all kinds of things just throughout, from beginning to end of the season, where, it was just so much fun seeing all of these things coming, back into focus. As I'm saying this, though, it makes me wonder, both for, appreciating the humor and for appreciating the lore and all that. I wonder if this show would even be remotely enjoyable to someone who'd never watched any Star Trek.
Well, funny you ask. You just reminded me because, I watched it with my girlfriend who is not a Trekkie. She just kind of casually watches the modern movies and whatever I force her to watch, But she really enjoyed it. She actually liked it a lot, but admittedly, I was pausing it every 2 minutes to say, like, oh, let me explain this. This is to really appreciate what's going on here, you have to know what they're calling back. And eventually, I think she got irritated with me. She's like, just play it already. I'm enjoying it fine.
Yeah, that's great. Yeah. Okay. Well, good. I'm glad that people can enjoy it on that level too.
Yeah, because they did such a great job of balancing, obvious, overt callbacks to previous episodes and just hidden little Easter eggs throughout that were just for a delight for the old school fans.
Yeah, and Chris, what you were just saying made me think we should explain that this is set 1 year after the movie Star Trek Nemesis, so it's like very much sort of classic TNG era. And it's before, I think Rafael and I were talking about this a little bit before we started recording, but, it's, Star Trek Picard, I think, picks up something like 5 years after this.
Yeah.
So this is, before, if you've seen Picard, there's this sort of, replicant uprising kind of, and the Federation kind of turning crappy and all this stuff. And so this is in this very sort of placid period in the continuity where, yeah, it does have just more of the flavor of classic Next Generation. And so one of the things I've said on our previous Star Trek panels that has sort of, frustrated me is that we keep going back in time, we keep doing prequels and everything. And that it's just been great for me to see Picard moving forward and Discovery moving forward. And now this is, I've always wanted, I've always been kind of like, let's just see what happens after,
totally.
after Star Trek Nemesis. And so, that's another point in favor of the show.
They really picked a perfect time period for the show because, essentially the most peaceful, stable time period in Trek history where everything is just pretty good. It's a great time it's a great entry point for, a show that's not too serious, but will probably get more serious over time.
I think they also understand from a marketing perspective, they are, going after my generation and the people who were 8 years old when TNG premiered. So it's sort of, grew up with the internet, grew up with memes as adults, not having it be part of our childhood. So I think that they also definitely made like a marketing ploy to the lovers of nostalgia.
Yeah. Well, so let's talk about the characters. So we have kind of four main characters, Mariner, Boimler, Tendi, and Rutherford. So we kind of have a headstrong rebel, a sort of anxious, neurotic, uptight guy. We have an Orion alien, so the green-skinned aliens who's, I guess she works in the medical bay. And then Rutherford has a cyborg eye and works in engineering. So, Chris, what did you think? What were your first impressions of those characters?
Again, I think the first two episodes, it took me a while to warm to the characters as well as to the show. And then after that, I came to, love them as much as I loved the wider show. At first, the kind of, in particular, I think the relationship between Mariner and Boimler was so frantic and adversarial and kind of in your face, like, almost like Three Stooges routines with them poking each other in the eye all the time, that it was maybe a little grating at first, but then I think they kind of, first of all, pulled back a little bit from that level of antics, and it became, a more mature relationship. But yeah, I mean, I think they're great characters. I'm really happy that they chose to make the Orion character be this very earnest scientist rather than, falling back on, the typical Orion characters. Like, they didn't make her some sort of, dancing bar girl or something.
Right.
And Rutherford is just amazing too. I mean, he's riffing on some of the stuff that we saw with Geordi with his ocular implants, and he's an always sort of evolving character, because that implant, gives him a variety of different things to play off of in various episodes as it either malfunctions or as he, it allows him to do things that need to happen for the plot. So yeah, I think it's a great bunch. I like all those four main characters.
Yeah, I guess I'll say with the characters is I thought that, I mean, I agree with you. I don't know, there's something, and you and Sarah had warned me that you were sort of lukewarm on the first two episodes, so I kind of knew that going in. And I don't know if it's just that they're not as good, or if you just kind of like have to get used to it takes, an hour or so to get used to the show or something. But I definitely, it took me until, 3 or 4 episodes in before I really got into it. And before those characters really started clicking for me. I do think the dynamic is really good, where there's this contrast between Boimler and Mariner, where, like I said, that she's very, like a rebel, and he's sort of a dweeb. And I really liked with Tendi and Rutherford that they're both so into science. And I thought that the way they talk about technology and all the technobabble and stuff was really well done. I was feeling a little bit like there wasn't enough of a contrast between their characters, that they kind of felt maybe too similar to me. So I don't know. I'd be curious to hear.
Well, I mean, they're setting those two up for romance. I mean, you just know that that is their end goal. Like I totally bet the Gold Press Latinum on that's what they're going to do, because, it's just obvious. And I love Tendi. She's so cute. I totally want to figure out how to do like a Tendi cosplay. Then whenever we have Star Trek Las Vegas conventions again, which, God knows how long it's going to be until we do those again. But yeah, I love those characters. And I really like that Mariner is really way more complex, especially, when you get to the end of the season than I had ever expected the animated series would be, delving into all of this psychological stuff about why she would be basically an overachiever who then decides, you know what, fuck it, I'm gonna, rebel and do my own thing, and for pretty complicated familial reasons. So it's weird to sort of find that even though you're watching all of this is sort of a joke that exists very much in isolation from the rest of the Star Trek universe, that you find yourself caring about these characters and, invested in sort of more character development than you're used to seeing in these animated things.
Mm-hmm. Do you think, Sarah, do you see Tendi and Rutherford as having distinct personalities from each other? Could you articulate what, if any, the differences are between them?
I think they're distinct, but I think they play off each other. So, it might just be that they need to develop it a little more down the line. And maybe that's why, they had Rutherford basically loses his memory. And there's this wonderful moment, at the end. And there's a wonderful moment when Tendi's like, you think she's just going to be completely crushed. And instead she's like, oh my God, this is so cool. We get to become best friends all over again. And she's just excited at this prospect of, so that's kind of what I mean, is the sort of, I like that there's a lot of unexpected, character responses that make the characters seem more real and more like themselves. And in that way, I think she was very different from Rutherford, because I think Rutherford would have been crushed if the situation were reversed, if Tendi had lost her memory.
Yeah, so I guess he's more fragile or something, I guess, or yeah. Rafael, is there anything you want to say about those main characters?
Sure. I think it's pretty interesting in terms of the character development over time. For a show that's largely episodic, they've done a great job, especially compared to other Trek shows that this kind of harks back to, like TNG. Because, usually those are kind of plot driven and the character development happens very, very slowly, if at all. But with this show, I know Mike McMahon and the writers set out to have a character arc, essentially like character progress for each episode, like what was going to happen to the character, and build a story around that. And I think like it's not an indictment on the first couple episodes that it does actually take a while for that to happen sometimes. Like in my experience, shows take 2 to 4 or 5 episodes for that to really click. Like I was watching Vagrant Queen earlier in 2020, and there's a moment in the second episode where you're like, I love these characters now. I get it. And I feel like with this show, it happens at various points. In the 4th episode, Mariner and her mother have a really great episode and a great sequence together. And then in the 5th episode, Mariner and Boimler really make strides in their relationship. So I think kind of piecemeal over the 3rd to 5th episodes, we really started to care more for these characters and their interactions with each other.
Yeah. Okay, so then we have the bridge crew. So we've got Carol Freeman, the captain, Jack Ransom, the first officer, Shax, the chief of security, and Tana, who's the ship's doctor, who's kind of a cat alien. Mm-hmm. So these are the characters who would be like the main characters in a typical Star Trek show. And here, that sort of flips where they're kind of secondary characters. But I don't know, Chris, what'd you think of those, the bridge crew?
Yeah, I mean, they're definitely much more sort of archetypes and stereotypes than they're less nuanced than the lower deck characters, but they're a lot of fun. I mean, I guess maybe my least favorite one, if I had to pick one, would be the Doctor. Only because it is so, it's sort of goofy. I know it harkens back to a character from the original cartoon series, which again I hadn't watched, but I guess that's where they get that species from. But again, like that's obvious to me. It's the most cartoonish element of the show, so I'm always a little bit like, when I'm in a scene with him. But they're fine. I think they work, and again, I think they work at their best when they're interacting, with the lower deck crews. I mean, whether it's Ransom interacting with Mariner, or just different sort of the way they play off each other is what's most interesting to me.
I'm glad they went for it with Tana, though, as a callback to the animated series, because you would never see that in a live action series. So it's kind of like, if you're going to do it, this is the time. Because you're right, it's inherently a little goofy, but it plays well enough when it's animated.
Mm-hmm.
And the Jack Ransom character, we should say, is a very obvious, like, Will Riker, like a super exaggerated kind of parody version of Will Riker. Sarah, what do you think about that bridge crew?
Yeah, I have to say the Doctor is actually one of my favorite characters, just because I've always loved the tradition in Star Trek of having these very grumpy doctors, and McCoy and the EMH in Voyager. And so I sort of love that they're combining these things and tying it to that reference and basically saying, that McCoy is a grumpy cat, and I'm here for it. I love it.
Yeah.
See, I was getting all excited when I saw the cat doctor because I thought, is it male or female? I thought the doctor was female.
It's female.
Female, yeah. That I thought that the doctor was a Kazin, because I knew that Larry Niven had written. I know that there was one episode or something that he was involved with somehow where he had put this is a cat alien species that features very prominently in his known space series of books and stories. And so I was all excited to be able to go into the whole history of that. But then it turns out that this cat is not a Kazin, but is something else, like a
Cadian.
It's like a Katin or something. So
yeah, but
I managed to work in my Larry Niven reference anyway. So
nice. I think the fact it's animated and comedy certainly affords some tonal advantages. You can have these secondary, somewhat one-dimensional characters, and it plays really well for laughs. I mean, like Shax, one of my favorite characters of the season. And I mean, that would never fly in a live-action show because you'd be like, well, this thing is just a caricature of a character. But it works for Lower Decks. I thought he was, same thing with Ransom. I mean, he's a caricature, but he's brilliant in his own way.
Yeah.
Yeah, I don't know if I want to get into spoilers this early in the discussion, but I think I'm going to, and just say that I was totally crushed when Shax died, and I was like, oh man, I don't know, and I don't know why, because like you say, yeah, he's just this kind of very one-dimensional, character, but like I was legitimately,
absolutely
distraught when he sacrifices himself in the finale. Well,
to our point earlier about how the show just gets better and better as it goes, those final 3 episodes were great. And that last one, I mean, I think that was really the moment for me where it struck how great this show could actually be, because, the whole thing is funny and amusing, but then it's really genuinely poignant when Shax sacrifices himself. And they played the funeral very straight, not for laughs at all. And I probably even teared up. It was emotional.
Yeah, I mean, especially when the captain says Shax is with the prophets now, because it shows that they're honoring not only the character, but the character's cultural history as a Bajoran, and it definitely, it was very poignant and unexpected in a way, but it kind of gave a center of gravity to the show that again just makes it all the more interesting.
Well, and I really respected the fact that they're not just going to stick with the status quo. I mean, by the end of, if we're going into just light spoilers here, just the fact that things are changing at the end of the season, characters moving on possibly to other ships, being promoted, I was impressed that we actually really don't know what season 2 is going to look like at this point,
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, so how about let's back up a little bit and just say, what are some of the moments that's like some of the episodes that stand out most in your minds, either good or bad? So Sarah, any episodes that, like, when you think of this show, like, what would be some of the first things to come to mind?
I think the finale was my favorite in terms of overall, just because it's sort of a culmination of the fact that you have with this show. I like the fact that they're telling one long story, but they are also very episodic. So for those that are, constantly crying about the lack of episodic Star Trek, this might be more up your alley. But at the same time, there are still character threads that are being played throughout the whole series. So I think I loved the final episode the most in total, but I think it's more like, because of the structure of the show, that they're just little moments that I were my favorite. Like when Boimler shows up with a Geordie teddy bear for his date, and I mean, a lot of the jokes are very visual, and it's one of the only criticism I have with the show is that, being 41 years old, it is genuinely difficult for me to watch something that happens so quickly, because you end up sort of having to you want to go back and rewind because you feel like you missed something all the time. And I listen to my audiobooks at 1.5 speed, so it isn't just that, it's the combination of quick visuals and quick dialogue that gets me. I wish that it was just slowed down maybe 20% the next season. But, so you have little moments.
I missed the Geordie teddy bear altogether, so.
See, you missed the Geordie teddy bear. And I mean, that's like a very small joke that references years of people talking about Geordie's romantic relationships in TNG and how problematic they were, and sort of arguing about the ethics of it, everything with Leah Brahms. Like, they put all of that into this funny little visual moment, and, blink and you miss it. And, there was a scene where they were on an alien planet and there were like numerous like Vasquez rocks, just the park in California that they always use for filming Star Trek because it looks like an alien environment, little things like that. But, again, it happens so quickly. And so you almost want to figure out a way to, can I play this at, 70% speed, please? Because, there's a lot of miss. But I think that rather than having favorite episodes, I just have a whole collection of favorite tiny moments like that.
Yeah, to Sarah's point, I do agree. It's more so a great collection of moments than singular episodes per se. I mean, when I think about some of the stuff that stood out to me, it's really throwaway moments. But there was a moment in the finale where engineer Billups is trying to suck up to Mariner now that they all know her secret, and he's just trying to give her a hand pie, and she's like, "No, I don't want a hand pie," and like it sent me down a spiral of trying to actually find hand pies, like Hostess pies. And I was determined. I was like, I really have a hankering now for a hand pie. But anyway, I think the first episode I really loved was Cupid's errant arrow, because I'm such a ship guy, and that USS Vancouver blew me away. Seeing the Parliament class like that, and it was just gorgeous, and the whole episode with Mariner and Boimler kind of becoming better friends, like through the whole, how can Boimler possibly have a girlfriend this cool? I don't know. The whole thing worked for me, but then as it got towards the end, Crisis Point, with the whole, show within a show, like the simulation and like all the throwbacks to the motion picture, like that was some really gorgeous stuff. The whole recreation of, the Cerritos, but like a ridiculously long sequence to hark back to the original introduction to the Enterprise.
Yeah.
Chris, you want to, what episode stood out to you?
I could just basically say ditto. But I'll just to expand very briefly. Yes, I totally agree as well that it's hard for me to pick an episode as my favorite. If I had to, it would probably also be Crisis Point. Again, just because it was sort of, I just had from beginning to end, a blast watching that episode for all the reasons Rafael mentioned. I also agree with the point that I'm sure for every, thing that I caught, there's like 3 things that I missed. So I would like to go back and rewatch these at some point, because it does all just zip right past you really fast. But I don't know. You also, I think, asked if we had favorites or least favorites. I don't know that, again, it'd be hard for me, other than the fact that I kind of struggled to get into it the first couple of episodes. So maybe one of those 2. But again, it would probably just come down to moments like, I get that it's funny, but I could take Badgie or leave him. Badgie's just sort of like, okay. Again, it's just like, it's almost like a bridge too far for me.
Yeah, this is the murderous hologram character who's shaped like the. I
get that they're riffing. Yeah, and I get that they're riffing on the fact that somehow, you would think they would have outlawed holodecks by this point because of all the murder and mayhem that they've caused in Star Trek history. And they're riffing on that, and so fine, I get it, but it's just like, well, okay.
Well, admittedly, I really liked Badgie because it was also a riff on the the Microsoft Word little paperclip assistant thing, and that just struck me. And I guess the moment where I was kind of won over by Badgie is when even he's getting tired climbing up the endless stairs chasing after them. I was like, all right, this is pretty fun.
Yeah, just to let everyone know, Star Trek shitposting considers Badgie basically canon, like Badgie is a beloved character in Star Trek shitposting. And I think a lot of that just comes from, the convention culture that, circulates this stuff, where a lot of people are, constantly buying the new badge from the new series, whatever it is, and the new cosplay or whatever. So it, just the idea of making that, a anthropomorphic character is great. I loved it. Like I was basically sold just on the concept alone. So
yeah,
soft spot for that.
So Sarah, you were saying that there's multiple things that people in Star Trek shitposting think that they, originated.
Yeah.
Like, what are some other examples of that?
So things like making fun of Captain Jellicoe. There is a whole series of memes within memes about making fun of Jellicoe. Because, so for those who remember the Jellicoe character in TNG, he came in and was basically assumed captaincy of the Enterprise for a couple of weeks, couple of months. I don't remember. It's been a long time. But he was basically a stand-in for Picard for a couple of episodes. And he was so different from Picard that a lot of the drama revolved around, how do we, react with this completely new character who has a very different style of leadership than Picard had. And so in Star Trek shitposting, Jellicoe is kind of this character that everybody kind of makes fun of. And when somebody in the group is being a little bit too, straight-laced about something or whatever, we call him Jellicoe. And so it's very meta. It's really hard to explain without actually, retreading all of the jokes and where it originated and everything. But it's just sort of become a straight-laced. And so at one point, I think Mariner calls a character, God, Jellicoe, and little things like that. And again, because they're happening so quickly, it's really even hard to even necessarily describe them as jokes. But it is something that you're going to enjoy a lot more if you are familiar with the history of making fun of that character than you would be otherwise.
Just a quick aside, shitposting groups are great, whether it's, Lord of the Rings Shire posting or, like Blade Runner shitposting. I don't know. There's so much great humor that comes out of those.
They really are.
Sarah, do you know if any, I looked around a little bit, but do you know if any, what would be the best resource for explaining all the little in-jokes and stuff in this show? Do you know of something?
I mean, there probably should be some sort of compendium online, and I'm sure one will pop up soon. Somebody out there has got to be obsessed enough with this to actually bother to put them all out there. But I don't think there is. I think it's one of those things that, at this point, you have 55 years or so of Star Trek, and you have something ridiculous, there's 600 hours of Star Trek available.
Yeah.
And it's almost at this point when you have a franchise that's this old, it ceases to become a franchise. Obviously, it still is from a legal perspective, but it becomes more like mythology, and so we are able to watch movies in this culture about Thor, understanding that there is a very long, complicated history tied to it that we're all sort of familiar with by osmosis, even though none of us have directly studied it other than the people who have, and little things like that. And so I feel like because Star Trek has become almost mythological on that level. I mean, imagine the Star Trek we're going to be watching in 50 years. It's hard to imagine at this point the series dying because the idea is unique enough and rich enough that you can always find little offshoots. There's so many things that they could do with this core idea of what is Star Trek. And so I think that it's fascinating to me as a fan that you can make a show this meta and have enough people enjoy it that it almost doesn't matter if half the jokes are lost on half the audience. And that's an extraordinary accomplishment.
Yeah. In terms of great resources, David, what I'd really recommend for this or any show, when I'm watching any show, Star Trek, Stargate, whatever, I like to keep up with the fandom Wikipedia entry for each episode. And for Star Trek, it's Memory Alpha, because if you go to any given episode, they talk about the background information, production history, continuity. Like I was just reading up on the finale, how there's part of Mariner's contraband is the infamous Spock helmet from the 70s, stuff like that.
Well, I mean, it sounds like we're all quite enthusiastic about this show. I did notice, where's the Rotten Tomatoes sort of overall summary thing is kind of lukewarm. So on Rotten Tomatoes, the show is 66%, and the site's critical consensus reads, fun but not very bold, Lower Decks flips the script on Star Trek regulation just enough to stand out in the franchise, if not the greater animation landscape.
Well, here's the thing you got to keep in mind about Rotten Tomatoes when it comes to TV. Basically, it's useless because the critics put up their reviews from just the first 2 or 3 episodes and then never revisit.
Okay, so you think, I want to get Chris back in here too, but everyone thinks that if, I don't know, because what's your perception of what the reception of the show has been? Because I don't feel like it's been as enthusiastic as we seem to be.
I think you have to be a member of the groups. Because I'm in Star Trek shitposting that has a ridiculous number of followers, and I'm in probably 10 groups just on Facebook alone. And that's not even including Twitter and Instagram and accounts that I follow there. And so you have to sort of be in those groups to understand what are the fans saying. And, that in itself can be a little bit, misleading because, for instance, if you go, there are certain groups on Facebook that are not very well modded moderated. And so you have groups, for instance, the Star Trek Picard group is a free-for-all. There's a lot of people who join just to be very toxic and say toxic, awful things about Star Trek Picard and link to their shitty YouTube videos explaining every nitpicky thing that they hated about it. And you have, just like with Discovery, you have people who talked about Lower Decks as, well, why is there a black captain and a black lead? Why both? And it's like, really? You're going to complain about that? So you have the full spectrum. But I think that, again, this goes back to how many people are familiar enough with Star Trek where you can do something like this that's an experiment. And I also think that the bar has to be a little bit less in terms of how many people they need in order to make a second season, right? Because with Discovery, the budget is so much greater. It's like 10 million an episode or something stupid. And so that obviously is not the same with Lower Decks. So they probably can also afford to be a little bit more niche.
Yeah, well, let me just explain quickly that the show was initially green-lighted for 2 seasons. So there is definitely going to, and the second season is in production now. But there was always going to be a second season. But Chris, do you want to, is there anything you've been wanting to say here?
Not with regard to, I mean, I don't really have any sense of what the reception has been, but I don't about most shows. So, that's nothing new. But the one thing that I was thinking before and then I forgot to mention is I really hope there's been, a lot of speculation about if we're going to see Riker appear again in season 2 of Picard. All I want to say is if he does, I sincerely hope that he engages his ship by saying warp factor at 5, 6, 7, 8. And they should keep that. That was one of my favorite laugh out loud moments of the entire
Yeah, I think I was screaming when that part happened. And I was watching it in the gym on my Peloton. And so, my boyfriend peeped in the room like, what, are you okay in there?
That was just brilliant. Along with Troy's, under the breath, like, oh, the jazz after that happened.
That was great.
Yeah, so I guess let's just explain, if you haven't seen the show, that at the very end of the finale, there are all these alien ships come in, and it looks like our heroes are doomed, and then Riker and Troy show up and kind of save the day, and then the implication is that Boimler is going to go off and serve with Riker and leave the other characters behind on their ship, the Cerritos.
And most triumphantly, that means that the Uss Titan Design in the Luna class is now official canon. So I'm very happy about that, as are others, I'm sure.
Could you just explain that for casual viewers?
Oh, sure. That design that they used for the USS Titan was first introduced on a book cover, I think 12, 15 years ago. Don't quote me exactly. And it became a fan favorite. I think it was actually a fan design. They held some kind of contest. If I'm wrong, someone will let you know. But that's how I remember it going down. So they finally made this canon, and that made a lot of people happy. So it was a pretty sweet design.
All right. Any other sort of episodes or moments that stick out to people? Rafael?
Oh, boy. I loved that moment. I can't remember which episode it is, but they're walking through the corridor, and Mariner and Tendi come across a non-corporeal entity, which we'd seen so many of over the years in Trek. And, of course, it's talking a big game, like how he's going to basically dominate the crew and destroy them. And she just starts stuffing it into a container. And he's like, wait, don't do that. And she's like, well, could you make me a tricorder? And he's like, well, maybe. It would take a lot of effort. I can put you in this container if you don't. It's like, essentially, she gets him to waste 9/10 of his energy on making a tricorder and battery, and then he just dies when he runs into the captain 2 seconds later. So I don't know, stuff like that really struck me. And the guy who wanted to become non-corporeal, essentially was just lying, but then actually does achieve it, but it was totally painful and horrible. I mean, that was fantastic.
Yeah.
Yeah, that was definitely one of the most memorable moments of the show to me. And I don't know that I even actually watched enough TNG to get the full story on what was going on there. But that's a reference to Wesley Crusher, turning into some super being or something? Or is there more to that that I'm not aware of?
I suppose that's kind of an oblique reference to Wesley and the Traveler and just any non-corporeal entity that they've come across. It actually kind of reminded me more of Stargate, to be honest. I thought the writers were probably just throwing in a little bit of love to Stargate because Ascension was a thing in that, like Daniel Jackson, and other characters aspired to leave the corporeal realm and become, higher beings.
Yeah, I think just as many specific jokes that they have. There are just as many jokes that work for the overall trope. So it doesn't necessarily have to be a specific episode if it's something that you recognize as, oh yeah, that happened in TNG like 10 times.
Yeah. I just love that the guy was a total fraud, but then accidentally found himself ascending, and it was such a horrible experience to go through.
Yeah, I mean, one of the best episodes, or one of the best examples of that, is when Mariner is convinced that that the girlfriend of Boimler is way too good for him to be real, and therefore she must be an alien. She must be, and it's like, okay, that's referencing several episodes of Star Trek where there's been a romantic interest, who turns out to be bad, or turns out to be, not being truthful, or turns out to be a murdering alien. And I'm like, yeah, that's literally what happened, like multiple times, at least one time per season. So yeah.
That was one of my favorite episodes, and I really liked kind of the twist at the end too, where it kind of reverses that. It was kind of like, it's been a while now since I watched the Orville, but that was kind of giving me big Orville flashbacks. I think there's sort of some similar ideas in there. And I think, Sarah, you don't like the Orville, right? Or like, because this would seem on its surface to be a pretty similar sort of show. So I'd just be curious to hear why you think why this works for you and the Orville doesn't.
So the Orville, first of all, features Seth MacFarlane, and Seth MacFarlane has an extremely punchable face, and you either love Seth MacFarlane or you cannot stand him and makes your skin crawl. And unfortunately, I am in that latter group. He has made my skin crawl ever since he hosted the Oscars. Like, I think before then I was pretty Seth neutral. And after that, I was just like, I hate this guy. And he can't really claim, because, he was sort of playing himself in that. So, you can't really complain that it's just the style of the Family Guy or whatever. I was also never super impressed with the Family Guy whenever I saw it. Like, there were always funny things, but not enough to go back and consciously watch it again. And so I watched a couple episodes of The Orville when it came out, and I totally understood what it was trying to do. And I think I honestly maybe even would have really loved it if he had been the showrunner and not also in it. And so part of my objections are totally, sort of personal and irrational. But I think that, because it's him, it's got this sort of 12-year-old boy humor in addition to being sort of a TNG fanfic show. And ultimately, I have so many friends who love it, and I don't think less of them at all. It just sort of, it wasn't enough for me to keep coming back. And so I think that it's just sort of complex for me. And part of that is that there are so many good shows right now. It's hard to keep up. It's you genuinely have anxiety about, like, oh man, like, how do I, it's almost like you look forward to when you can finally call something. Like, I'm totally on the fence right now about WandaVision. And, it seems to be one of those things that people either are going to love or hate. And so far, I'm really not sold on the concept. And, it's almost like, oh, it will be such a relief if I don't like this, because I can have time for other things.
Yeah.
Well, but the TNG fanfic with the 12-year-old boy sense of humor, like, could apply to Lower Decks, right?
A
lot of this stuff.
I think that if Lower Decks had more male characters as their main character, like if Boimler was the main character, and, his buddy, instead of being Mariner, was, say, Tendi, and she was just there for the supporting romance. Like, it's very subtle, but very dramatic if you are used to always seeing the guy be the main character. And so I think that if Lower Decks had just been ever so slightly different in terms of temperature, it would have been enough to turn it off for me. If the main character weren't female, it would have been enough to turn it off for me. So it's almost refreshing seeing a female character deliver lines that are bawdy than it is to see Seth MacFarlane deliver the same lines or something similar.
Well, this is actually kind of fascinating because I didn't even think about this till right now, but I don't actually view, in my mind, Boimler and Beckett are co-main characters. So it's kind of interesting how we both kind of watch it but take something different from it, which is kind of relates to your point. That's interesting.
Yeah, I mean, I see him as slightly more of a supporting character than her. But yeah, I mean, he probably gets as much, whatever the animated equivalent of screen time is.
Yeah.
It's funny. You talk about Seth MacFarlane. I had totally forgotten until I just a couple of months ago went back and did a rewatch of Enterprise that he actually has like a recurring cameo role on Enterprise where he plays one of the engineering crew on there. And when he first reappeared on the show, I guess when I saw it the first time or the previous time through, I didn't know who Seth MacFarlane was. So it was just like random, guy. When I suddenly see Seth MacFarlane's big face in those scenes, I remember thinking like, oh yeah, he must, right. He must be a bad guy. He's going to somehow pull a double cross here. And then he doesn't. But I think the only reason I thought that is because his face was so punchable that I wanted Trip to end up punching him. Yeah. And it never happens. He's just like But anyway, that's very funny.
I respect the fact that he's a Star Trek fan. He grew up with Star Trek. It's very clear that he loves it. I've got no beef. It's just, it's not enough for me to show up for him. You know what I mean?
Right.
Yeah. Well, Chris, let me ask you, because you said that you tend to hate it when they take something, in general, when they take something kind of serious or that you like and try to make it, change it to make it funnier or whatever. And there is a lot of sort of like, I think Sarah used the word body or maybe that was Rafael, but sort of risque, kind of, there's like stuff that's bleeped out. I'll just read this. This is the part that jumped out at me. Is they're trying to get Mariner to the captain and first officer are trying to get Mariner to quit and move to another ship, and the captain says, "Then give her worse jobs." And the first officer says, "I've got her emptying bleep out of the holodecks bleep filter." And the captain says, people really use it for that? And he says, "Oh yeah, it's mostly that."
That was so great.
That's great. No, well, to answer your question, or what I think your question is, this was a fear that I had before watching it. It works for me though, because even though it is comedic and all the rest of it, I don't feel like it's a show where they just completely pulled the rug out and did something totally like off the wall and different. It feels like a Star Trek show. It even though it's animated, even though it's got way more humor than any of the other shows, you could almost look at it, but it still remains true to the canon and to the rules that have been established in the Star Trek world. So it's not just like, oh, this is just some goofy nonsense. Like you could almost look at it as though this is sort of the, I don't know, like a history of this era of Star Trek written, by a historian with a great sense of humor, so it's just the presentation of it that's funny, but the core show itself is just as much a Star Trek show as any other one.
Oh, yeah. It connects so well and meaningfully to prior shows. One of my favorite moments was in Temporal Edict, when the whole thing about buffer time, that was one of the episodes for me that really pushed the show forward into the next level. And that whole thing called back that classic TNG episode with Geordi and old Scotty. Remember that one where he's like, "You've got a lot to learn, Sonny, if you want people to think of you as a miracle worker," because Geordi was mistakenly just telling Picard how long things actually take. He's like, "No, lad, you can't do that." And gosh, yeah, I had other ones in mind a moment ago. Oh, the Exocomp Peanut Hamper. That was a great example of bringing back a wonderful episode element, but in a really funny way. And then when Peanut Hamper refuses to essentially do a suicide mission, he's like, "Nope, I'm out."
Yeah, well, because I just listened to an interview with Mike McMahon. It was like a 2-hour-long interview, and that was when I really started getting this vertiginous sense of like, wow, there's so much stuff in this show that is just going over my head. But he was, because the thing I was gonna, my note on that quote that I just read was that I felt like this show was dealing with a reality that, yeah, people would be like having sex with holograms, right? Like if there's a holodeck, like that's what everyone would be using it for. And that this show is kind of going there when Star Trek didn't. But he was making it sound like there was a character that came, I forget, in this show, I think in this show there's a character named Fletcher or something who was modeled on a character named Barclay, I think.
Yeah.
Can someone explain to me, because he was saying something about Barclay's like harem of hologram characters or something like that.
I mean, again, this is like a thing that, is super entrenched in Star Trek shitposting, because it's something that got made fun of over and over and over again, and just sort of all of the things that you would imagine would actually take place on these holodecks unless there were very specific rules against it. And the fact, I mean, they had an episode of Voyager when Tuvok goes and, the doctor basically has to program a holographic program because he's going through Pon Far and he's not with his wife because his wife is in this other, far, far away. So they have a whole episode about that. So, it makes sense.
It was certainly addressed repeatedly and point blank on Deep Space Nine too, with Quark's hologram. I mean, everyone was using that for sex, basically.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Either that or doing the Battle of Britain. It was like one or the other,
But, Barclay was a classic character. He really grew on me over time. I didn't like him at first, admittedly. But, when they kept bringing him back for Voyager and future appearances, I thought it was pretty endearing, because the thing with him was he was kind of incompetent, but also supremely competent. He just wasn't a good officer. And I was reading how McMahon basically said Fletcher was kind of an analog to that. Essentially, he had some skills, but was not a good officer. And so I love that he gets promoted mistakenly and then immediately fired, because he should never have been promoted.
Let's see. Just look at my notes here. I thought it was interesting that Star Trek author David Mack served as a consultant on the series to ensure the series would fit within the franchise's canon. So, because like I was saying, like so much of the stuff, like the techno babble, like, it seems like really, really good. I got the sense that, I mean, they're just totally it's just kind of like throwaway lines, but I really got the sense that, there's some Star Trek book somewhere that all these things, have some fictional reality to them.
Yeah.
Well, one example of that, and that's another one of those just like throwaway lines that it's like you'll miss it if you don't hear it. At one point, they referred to a part of the ship as cetacean ops, which is fantastic, because it's like, I guess that's the part of the ship where they carry the whales, which we were talking about last time. Where did they fit a whale on a ship?
Yeah, which is a reference to Star Trek 4. That actually, one thing I wanted to bring up, I guess, Star Trek 4 is really, thinking back on it now, it's one of my favorite Star Trek movies, but it's really a comedy. I mean, I feel like, it's as much a comedy as anything else, and more so, I feel like, than any of the other Star Trek movies. I'm trying to think, but I feel like Star Trek 4 is a comedy that works, and so much of, and maybe part of the reason I was sort of apprehensive about this show is I feel like there's been a lot of Star Trek humor that has not worked.
Right.
Particularly like the later TNG movies. I feel like there's a line that really, I actually wrote it down. It's so bad, but so in Second Contact, which overall is a movie I like a lot, but there's a part where they're talking to Zefram Cochrane.
I mean, First Contact.
Oh, sorry. I have a note here about Second Contact. Okay, yeah. Star Trek First Contact.
Lower Decks is about Second Contact.
You're right.
Yeah, see, that was the next thing I was going to go. We'll get to, once I finish up on First Contact, then we'll get to Second Contact. But where they're talking to Zefram Cochrane, and they say, and he says something like, "So you're all astronauts on some kind of Star Trek." It's just like one of the worst jokes in any movie I've ever seen. And so I think that was part of the reason I was apprehensive about the potential for Star Trek humor.
I mean, I feel like partly why, but you can't really, I mean, the tone of TNG is overall so serious. I think they struggled with humor just because of that, because they didn't really factor that in, in terms of how to make that work. And when it worked, it was usually involving Data or Worf. Like it was really difficult. And I think that, the Cromwell, the actor who played Zefram Cochrane in that film, did a great job. And that was definitely one of the cringeworthy lines that you feel like were almost put there as a joke for somebody who is watching this movie who isn't a Star Trek fan, which was weird. But yeah, I feel like TNG overall was almost so serious and took itself seriously to the point where it was almost difficult for them to do comedy when they did.
I feel like there were a lot of funny moments. I can't think of one right now, but whenever Picard would get upset and play something very straight, essentially be the straight man in a scene where something terrible was happening, around him. But there was definitely some funny moments in that sense. But what's interesting about the fourth movie, to your point, David, is it was kind of the end of that trilogy. Like, it was an unofficial trilogy of movies, but they kept the continuity from Wrath of Khan to Search for Spock to... what was the fourth one called? Voyage Home. But the tone changed dramatically from 2 to 3 to 4. So
yeah, it worked. It's really amazing. I spend way more time thinking about that movie than I should. Mm-hmm. I've probably seen it about 300 times.
Well, one of my favorite episodes of this season was Veritas, the way it harked back to the Undiscovered Country. They took the whole trial motif, I thought, from that, Yeah.
Yeah, and that's something that you would never have thought that they were going to make fun of, because it works as drama. So why would they make fun of it? But they did, and it was great.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and that's an example of what I was talking about earlier, where Mike McMahon is able to have these really genuinely kind of inventive science fictional plots in these cartoons with humor. And so in that one, Rutherford is sort of pressured into I forget, he somehow he installs some sort of software update into his cyborg eye, and this causes him to constantly be rebooting. And so while he's kind of unconscious, his cyborg, I hope I'm getting the details right here, but his cyborg implants are kind of taking over, and so he's having all these adventures, but he's only kind of like seeing. Like hours will pass, and then he sees a couple seconds, and then hours pass, and he sees a couple seconds, and he has absolutely no idea what's going on. But it's really like, you're like, oh, this is really inventive. And, I haven't seen this story before.
Yeah, overall, the way that they made fun of the technology itself, the technology was allowed to be imperfect, whereas in TNG, you take it for granted. But in Lower Decks, it's like, oh, well, it makes sense that you would, be in a crisis, and all of a sudden the tech would want to reboot something or would want to download the latest update the way that our tech does. And that's a wonderful thing to play with.
Sarah, our tech, we never have any problems with our tech. I know what you're talking about.
Yeah, it's certainly nothing to do with trying to use simple pair of Bose headphones to Bluetooth, 2 different Bluetooth technologies. Surely nothing like that.
But yeah, so let's see. So Chris, anything else to say on the humor? It all worked for you here? No wrong notes? Or
no, I mean, it actually, like I said, I was a little lukewarm to Badgie, but other than that, it all does work. And again, I think the reason it works is because the humor never broke with canon. And I think if it did, then it would have just seemed like this was all just some sort of bit of silliness. But the fact that the humor was all within, the rules, it actually made it work all that much better for me.
Yeah. All right. So now that we've wrapped up First Contact, we will move on to Second Contact. So in the first episode, I guess, the way we're kind of introduced to this world is that, you've got the Enterprise, the real like adventurous heroes who make first contact with all these alien civilizations, and then you have the ships like the Cerritos, where they're kind of like not as good, and they come along afterward and set up the communications equipment and restaurants or something like that. I thought that was really, that makes sense that you would have that the Starfleet would need people like that, the Second Contact kind of teams, and I thought it was kind of interesting that as far as I know, we've never seen that before. And that this show kind of, brought that to the fore.
Mm-hmm.
Definitely.
Yeah. Nobody has anything else to say about Second Contact?
Only just that I think that where a lot of the fan love comes in with stuff like this is that, you know, you have so much in Star Trek because you're always seeing what's going on the bridge. You know, part of the wish fulfillment aspect is you wonder what it's like to just live on the ship. You know, you wonder what it's like to just hang out and observe. And so I think that, you know, that this scratches that particular desire from a fan perspective. So, you know, with that in mind, they have so much that they could do to play with it. So it's just a neat idea because it doesn't come out of nowhere. It doesn't exist in a vacuum. It really is in response to thinking about what do people feel when they watch Star Trek? What are people thinking about inserting themselves into those situations? And, you know, how all of that would play out. So I think that that's one of the reasons why I feel like they actually have a lot of material to work with here.
Yeah, you know, it was a great concept for the show and the ship's mission, because just as the show itself focuses on the lower decks and the characters that are kind of off-center, so is the entire Cerritos. You know, they're part of the lower decks of Starfleet. They're not, you know, getting a glamorous assignment, but it's actually a vital assignment. So, you know, I actually think it was kind of perfect. You know, this is a macro analog to the point of the show.
Yeah.
Yeah, I also thought it was, you know, I mean, because there's so much... It's such a thing in making fun of Star Trek, the idea that, you know, the captain and the first officer and the doctor and then some random red shirt beam down to the planet and then the red shirt dies. I think there would be sort of the most obvious thing to do with a show like this is that they're all like dying all the time, and, you know, and how do they feel about dying all the time? And that I was actually really glad that they didn't take that route, and that they, you know, yeah, they took it more seriously in a way. I mean, I think that, yeah, there's not even a single reference to like red shirts dying in this show.
And thank God, because it's kind of like when somebody makes a red shirt joke in Star Trek shitposting, everybody kind of piles on and makes jokes like "Welcome, new member,"
Right.
because it's just been played out to death, and I really appreciate that. You know, this is a very sophisticated show who sort of, you know, did their research and or are just a part of these subcultures anyway to start with. So they already know these things have already been done. We're not going to make, I mean, people send me memes all the time that originated in Star Trek shitposting 3 years ago. And like people who are not Trekkies, and they send it to me because they know I like Star Trek, and they have no idea that not only have I seen that meme 3 years ago, but I've seen all 10 memes that reference it ever since, you know, and it's, you just sort of have to like it. Oh, thanks for sending me that, grandma, and, and move along. But so I really appreciated that the show did not say we're going to do Galaxy Quest except as a series.
Yeah. Also, you know, it just wouldn't really be timely by this time of this show because the colors had changed from 100 years prior. You know, Next Generation changed up the color codes.
Yeah, it's really a TOS joke.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Only.
Yeah. that you know, one thing about Second Contact, the episode, also, you know, I do think that they still hadn't quite, you know, in the first couple episodes, as we said, nailed to the two sort of main characters, Boimler and Mariner. But even in that early episode, we really start to get, you have this, one of my favorite moments with the Orion character. What is she? Tendi. She, like, when they show her down where they all sleep in the sort of bunks or whatever, and it's like, yeah, sorry, this is where we are. And she looks, and it's like, they just have this view of like the two nacelles like glowing on either side. And she's just like, they're like apologizing to her, and she's like, oh, it's perfect, you know, and just how much she loves being able to see, you know, the engines in action. And they also sneak in that great joke. They were just like, yeah, and we're also right by the showers, so it gets kind of musty down here, which is weird because they're sonic showers.
That was a great moment, though. Like, it was honestly heartfelt and gorgeous the way they illustrated that. I really liked it.
Yeah, I did too. I mean, it set up Tendi right away. Like, you understood who Tendi was going to be, and it made her interesting to me.
Yeah, it kind of illustrated how, you know, jaded everyone else around her had become, because to any of us, how incredible would that be? Just that view.
Yeah.
Right, cool. Any thoughts on season 2? Any predictions or things you're hoping to see?
I don't know. I was so surprised by everything that I liked in season 1 that I don't know. I'm just happy to let them surprise me again, to be honest.
How long do you think that Boimler will stay with Riker?
That's honestly the big question. I mean, I have no idea, and I kind of like not having any idea. I guess I haven't even really tried to think about it because I'm just going to sit back, and if they actually keep him with Riker and Troy for a while on the Titan, that'd be kind of awesome. But I'm sure they probably won't. Like, eventually they'll find a way to bring him and Beckett back together.
Yeah, I have no expectations just because, I think it's well done enough that they could do so many things with it at this point that I have absolutely no idea what they're going to do. And it's nice. It's a nice place to be. And I think that, if they do get to the point where there are always new Star Trek, they might lose something because I feel like, when there are periods of dry Trek, I'll go back and check on things that I hadn't necessarily paid attention to. And like when Lower Decks first came out, I was watching every episode when it came out until about halfway through. And then I got busy. I think the Christmas season, was a sort of overwhelming, and there were a lot of things going on, even though we were all in quarantine, which is actually amazing. But, I just kind of lost track of it. And then I thought, oh, I'll go pick that up later. So the fact that, we go through periods where, and, I had originally, when Voyager originally came out, I watched it up until the introduction of 7 of 9. I was so mad at how they handled that I stopped watching. And then I picked that back up again during dry Trek. So I think even just having a few months where there isn't new Star Trek is kind of good for their overall bottom line, because you sort of check on the things that you're not as super excited about and catch up.
True. In terms of season 2, I'm just glad they did get that 2-season order, like you mentioned, David. So this way we know they had a plan from the start for 2 seasons, and at least that much will be a really cool story.
Yeah, it makes sense too. It's almost like at this point, you almost have to, I don't know why more shows don't just start out with a 2-season order, because it takes a long time for the hype and the fans of a show to assemble and recognize each other. And sort of, these days with shows, advertising itself isn't even anywhere near as powerful as people talking about your show on Facebook. So sometimes it takes a bit for that to catch up with itself. And you see, shows that were just recently canceled. We just started watching Brave New World, and it was already canceled, with Peacock, which is a really weird venue for that show. And it's just like, oh, okay. So
I was just about to mention Brave New World. It drives me insane when expensive shows aren't just given 2 seasons right off the bat. I mean, if you're remotely interested in a thing, it's like, you're not just going to call quits after 1 date. You're probably going to go on 2 dates. I don't know. Give it a chance.
Yeah, it's a really naive way of understanding how sort of, shows sort of build their fan base and snowball, and we have plenty of examples, like what happened with Firefly. This is not hard, you guys.
Yeah, it takes time. And I don't know if you saw my thread on Facebook, Sarah, but I posted about Brave New World, and 10 or 12 people said they loved the show. I mean, that was a show that really could have, and interestingly enough, for whatever reason, they were all women too. Like, that show really hit strong with women, if my Facebook was any indication.
I had a few issues with it, but I think it was good overall in it. And the issues that I had with it were specific. And so it's like, overall, what they were doing, they were doing really well. So I was disappointed.
So bottom line, David, you should watch Brave New World.
Yeah, I was going to say, save it for the Brave New World panel. I guess it sounds like we've pretty much said everything we have to say about Star Trek Lower Decks. Any other final thoughts or anything?
I guess my closing thoughts are, I really loved the California class ships. Being a Californian, I thought that was just a really cool little thing. And I loved how the ships even had color stripes to denote what they were for, whether a medical ship, like second command or second contact ship. I just thought that was a neat innovation. And just overall, the show, it's a vibrant, gorgeous, hilarious, and heartfelt addition to the Star Trek canon. I mean, I was dubious, but I can't recommend it enough. It's great.
All right, cool. Chris, any final thoughts?
No, just basically to say more or less the same thing, that it, if you have not yet watched it, do give it a chance. And by this third or fourth episode, it definitely, kicks into high gear, and I was very, very pleasantly surprised by it. I'm definitely, looking forward to the second season.
Yeah. And Sarah, final thought.
Just, if your Star Trek love language is making fun of Star Trek, then this is the show for you.
Yeah, it's enjoyable, and I mean, it's definitely, like, I don't know. At first glance, it might seem to be just kind of like a filler, kind of throwaway thing, but it was obviously, when you watch it was obviously made with a lot of love and a lot of knowledge of Star Trek. Yeah. And so, if the idea of a humorous Star Trek cartoon appeals to you at all, and maybe even if it doesn't, it's definitely worth watching at least the first 3 episodes and seeing seeing how you like it from there.
Because, I wasn't kidding. I really enjoyed Picard and Discovery, but if I could only keep one of these shows going forward, it's probably Lower Decks.
Yeah, well, I'm sure Mike McMahon will be happy to hear that. All right, cool. So why don't we wrap things up there? So we've been speaking with Sara Lynn Michener, Rawfield Jordan, and Christopher M. Cevasco. So thanks, everyone, so much for joining us.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks a lot, man.
And that was our panel. So big thanks again to Sara Lynn Michener, Rafael Jordan, and Christopher M. Cevasco for joining us on the show. And remember that Geek's Guide to the Galaxy is made possible thanks to support from listeners like you. So if you enjoy the show and want it to continue, please sign up to give us $1 or $2 per episode over at patreon.com/geeks. And if you'd rather make a one-time contribution, you can do that via check or PayPal over at geeksguideshow.com/crowdfunding. So big thanks again to everyone who's contributed. We really appreciate it. All right, so that was our show. So thanks everyone for listening, and we'll see you next time.
The Geek's Guide to the Galaxy is a production of Wired.com. For more information about the show, visit geeksguideshow.com. To learn more about your host, visit davidbarrkirtley.com. Music and voiceover produced by yours truly, Jack Kincaid. If you enjoyed this program, tell your friends. If you didn't enjoy it, tell no one. Thank you for listening.